And I remember being turned over and pushed down, and then someone was having sex with me. I woke up the next morning in my underwear, and I was completely confused. I had no idea what was going on. I went to the toilet, and I had blood on my anus. You're so blanked from whatever I had been given that my
Mhm.
memory couldn't make sense of what had happened. I didn't go to the police, which I should have after everything had happened. I spoke to my ex-girlfriend from university. When I told her, she just said, "I'll be on a plane tomorrow."
Mm.
And that meant a lot to hear that from someone. I remember looking for a therapist. It didn't exist. You couldn't find a therapist who had ever dealt with men who had
Yes.
been raped. In the early 2000s, this wasn't spoken of.
Hello and welcome to Ego Was Here. Today I'm joined by Chris Ingram. Once an international model, Chris is now a martial arts coach whose life was forever changed by a traumatic experience he kept silent for years. Today, he's breaking that silence to raise awareness and challenge the stigma surrounding male survivors. Hello, Chris.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great and I'm so happy to have you here
I'm really
and
pleased to
for
be here.
having the courage, to share your story.
It's a long story. We'll get there. It's
I'm
a long
sure, I'm
story.
sure it
Not
is.
we'll well hopefully I can manage the emotions that come with it sometimes. I do have moments. They're very odd moments.
Mm,
Hard to understand when they come, but they do come periodically. So we'll get through it.
yes. So, Chris, take me back to the beginning. Like, who was Chris before the modeling industry entered your life?
Yeah, my journey was an interesting one. I came from a quite a privileged background. My father was, and both my parents were working in large international institutions. I grew up all over the world. Um, I went to school in the United States, and eventually I went to university in Canada. And I finished university, um, and I studied development studies in political science and economics. I had an internship at the UN. I didn't like it, and then so my story is I was walking down the street in Toronto after I'd finished university in Montreal, and I walked to the gym past a hairdresser, and I went in to get a haircut, and I made friends with the guys who ran the hair salon, and they said, they were the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. They were so full of energy, so interesting, so entertaining. And they said, why don't you try modeling? Can we put you in a show that they were putting on? And that kind of started it. So I knew nothing about the industry. I came from a very sort of sheltered suburban neighborhood in the 1980s and 90s. And the context about the 80s and 90s is actually significant when we get into the story a little bit,
Hmm.
because it
Hmm.
was very sheltered, very, very much a protected environment, especially in the United States, where suburbs are very sort of isolated. And then
Hmm.
you go into the big city once in a while, and you're like, ooh, but but for the most part, I went to a private school. It was an old naval preparatory academy for the U.S. Navy.
Hmm.
So we wore jackets and ties um, and so yeah, and that was my introduction into the modeling and acting world in Toronto in the early mid early 1990s. Toronto at the time was going through sort of a very um, big movie. The movie business was kind of booming in Toronto in the
Hmm.
90s. The International Toronto Film Festival started to get very popular, and the modeling industry kind of started to take off. Um, and then when I was in Toronto, I was working in Toronto. I had a couple parts in some big movies, and was getting into the business, and then had the opportunity to get on a plane and fly to Paris. Um, and so
Hmm.
that's what I did. Um, I said, okay, I've been to Paris before. It wasn't my first time, but I was like, because I'd been growing up all over the world in West Africa, um,
Yes.
Europe. And then I landed in Paris, and that was my introduction to the real modeling industry, let's call it. Toronto is
Yes.
kind of was kind of parochial in that sense, but uh, I got to Paris, and that's during a show season. So the show season, if you've ever experienced a show season as a model, it is chaos. You're running around the city seeing 10 clients a day. Um, no idea where you are, have a little map in your hand, and they say, go here, here,
Hmm.
here, and here. That you have very little contact with your agency other than this is your client list. This is who you go see. Off you go. Um, and that's
So,
for
what
I
did the
probably was
industry?
20 years old at the time.
Yeah. What did the industry promise young people that made it so irresistible?
I think it was different for different people. Um, for me, it was opportunity to. I mean, because there's a lot of glitz and glamour sold. Like, you're going to be a model, you're going to go to Paris, you're going to, and so there is that element of. And I think I have to differentiate between the men in the business and the women in the business, because the men in
Hmm.
the business tended to be in their early 20s, and the women in the business tended to be in their late teens. Um,
Yes.
and
Yes.
there is that sort of that gap that I became very obvious to me, and we'll get into it later about how the business works, because it's a very strange business. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but there is that sort of split, and it's always important to keep that context in mind when you think of how the industry works. Is that the girls tended to be younger and much more naive of what was going on, whereas a lot of the guys had been to university, were had been in some sort of business, and were a bit more aware of things, um, but not all things, because a lot of it is hidden.
So, so,
Um,
so looking back now, were there warning signs that seemed completely normal at the time?
no, not initially. So when I arrived in Paris, and this is a big thing actually, but the first night I had arrived in Paris, um, we got put in a what they call the model apartments. Ours
Hmm.
was a very dingy hotel in the red light district called the Hotel Royal Pigalle, right on Pigalle Square in Paris. Um,
Hmm.
we created sort of scenarios of there were sort of Israeli gun runners living in the hotel with us, people we didn't know, but that's kind of what the
Oh,
8 guys living there were like. What do these guys do? And we're like, there's something not right here. But so we were in that place. But the first night is the agency phones us up and says, look, all of you guys, we want you at this restaurant at this time, and we're having a dinner. And my first night in Paris, I was introduced to my abuser. The abuse happened much later, but that first night was the first night that I met the person who ended up um, abusing and raping me.
mm,
So the introduction was there, and these dinners happened. And what I would come to learn of the business is that the dinners like this were very free. This was completely common. The agency set up dinners, and when you put this in the context of the Epstein files and stuff we'll discuss later, is those dinners are sort of prearranged. And those introductions, it's your agency sets it up. You're there with people they say are from the industry. Some of them are not. You could be doctors, it could be lawyers, it could be
hmm,
PR people, it could be anybody, that knew the agency, or in some cases was paying for access to go to those dinners to be introduced to the models.
Mm.
This was very common. But not at the time, it just felt like a fun dinner. We're going to go to dinner. We're going to go to a nightclub. We're going to go have fun. That's how they sell it. And that's how you perceive it. Um,
Yes.
until you start to see the darker side of things. And that really did take time. I don't think anyone was straight away aware that there was anything sort of underhanded or nefarious going on at the time.
Chris, was exploitation something people openly talked about, or was it simply understood and never questioned?
Um, it's hard because in the business, you're kind of conditioned to accept forms of exploitation, so it does get normalized. Like
Within certain
for
boundaries, right?
so if say you're doing a job, so and
Hmm.
I'll just relate a story much later in my career, but I was in Germany. I was shooting an underwear catalog for a big German underwear company. And in a day, I probably they took pictures of me in 100 different pairs of underwear. And the stylist will come, I'm not joking, and make adjustments to your crotch. So
Mm.
you're kind of like treated like this sort of
Yes.
thing, and they'll say, you know, just put this on, and they'll throw you whatever it is, and you put it on, and you're like, okay, it's just part of the business. It got to the point where you do so many changes that you don't even go to the changing room anymore because it's so tedious. You just like, I don't care. I'm gonna change right here. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
fast. I need to just get.
Mhm.
So you totally normalize stuff that, but any other circumstance would not be a normal sort of thing, and that would go across things. Um, just in terms of the business, then the exploitation tends to not happen as much in the business aspect of things, although there were photographers, um, designers who were very suggestive or very touchy, and it kind of you kind of just accept it. Even agents who, for men who were openly gay, and joked a lot about, you know, breaking down the straight boys. There was a lot of this
Yes.
kind
Yes.
of, and for me, that never bothered me. If I
Hmm.
look at it in a different context, it's totally inappropriate. If that same context were applied to a young girl, it would be totally inappropriate. Um, and it happened with the young girls as well. I mean you know, you're too skinny, lose weight, put this bra on, take your top off. You know, this was just normal sort of behavior, and that happened in an age spectrum for the girls, right? 15, 16, 17-year-old girls, take your top off, taking Polaroids. Um, yeah, so it's just a very strange industry that you kind of, like I said, you always have to add that context to it,
Hmm.
and then the time context. So let's think about this. It's late '80s, early '90s, the age of the supermodel. So mid '90s, that sort of the rise of the supermodel, and the rise of that sort of aura, um, that kind of developed in the 1990s with the industry, and how the industry started to sort of really commercialize and become very, very popular. Um,
Mm.
before that, it was much more, fashion was much more like niche. And in the '90s, it sort of exploded. Um, yeah, so very, very interesting business as a whole.
I've read your articles, and
Mm.
what stood out to me is that you often describe it as a system, rather than a collection of bad individuals. What made you see it that way?
So when when I started to see the way that the business functions. So when I became more sort of business savvy,
Mhm.
um, and you start putting pieces together, the way that the agencies, um, I'll give you an example. When I got the opportunity to go to Paris,
Mhm.
my agency in Toronto says to me, Chris, you've been asked to go to Paris, and you're sold whenever you sign with an agency, it's kind of sold to you like lucky you. But the
Yes,
truth
yes.
is, if you think of it, it's the opposite. The agency is looking to find me where I pay them to find me work. They're not
Mhm.
paying me anything. So but it sells that way, right? So, oh,
Yes,
you've
yes,
signed
yes.
with this agency. The truth is, it doesn't make a difference. I'm paying them a percentage of my earnings to go and find me work. Not the other.
Mhm.
It's not the other way around. But it's sold that way. It's sold like that. Your agent is your. It's the be all end all. And as I got into the business, and the business is split. It splits. So there's what I would call supermodels. So the people being flown here, there, and then what I call working models. So it's split into three actually. Working models. So people who are shooting catalogs, shooting TV commercials, and you kind of grind. You earn a good day rate, um, and you kind of grind through the work. You shoot this German catalog. You shoot in Lederhosen. You shoot in mowing a lawn. But you're getting paid well. That you kind of
Mhm.
and underwear, t-shirts, whatever it is, you're kind of grinding through these things. The supermodel, the fashion side of the business actually pays nothing. So if I shoot and I shot a couple campaigns for designers, and then I would go and I'd be like, oh, what's the rate? And they're like, oh, it's like €1,000. I said, €1,000. This is like a big deal. And they're like, yeah, but it's the honor of doing the job.
Yes,
So
yes.
the only things that paid a lot of money were perfume campaigns, um, really perfume, and then commercials, um,
Mhm.
and then your day rate for catalogs. So you got the fashion stuff to book so that you were recognizable to be able to do um, the commercial stuff, the
Yes.
catalogs, and then your day rate would go up with the amount of sort of higher profile jobs that you did. Um, and that's how that system of would work. But as I get to Paris, they say to me, Chris, you're going to Paris. The agency will cover your costs. They pay for your hotel. They pay for your apartment or whatever, and your flight. They don't tell you that you owe that money back. So they make it seem like they're taking care of you, right? So you land in Paris, you want to leave, and they say, well, you owe us whatever, €20,000. And you say, "What? No, no, no." And imagine a 15-year-old girl. You can't leave. We
Yeah.
have your passport.
Yes,
You
yes.
owe us €20,000. You're not working. You need to now go to hostess a party. You need to now go, on a yacht with this man. Like, and this is where it
Mhm.
starts to get systemic.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
The girls, I don't think were ever strong enough to and didn't understood that they could say no. I, when my agency in Paris, I did the show season there. I didn't book any shows. I said I'm off to Italy. I'm going to Milan. You owe us money. I said, well, haven't signed a contract. So what are you going to do? And I'm old enough and I
Yes.
have enough sort of
Mhm.
sorry, not my problem. You took a risk. It didn't pay off. I took a risk. I spent money here as well. It didn't work out. And then off I went to the next. And then the agency either keeps to represent you or they sort of scrap you and throw you on the scrap heap.
Yes.
And
Mm.
that I came very aware of that and that early. So I was able to see the system for what it was, the way that they did billing on your accounts, like the charges. This is a great example. I always tell it, but I shot this campaign. It was in Uomo Vogue, so Men's Vogue, which
Yes, yes,
was
of
in
course.
the 1990s was like this, right? It's like
Yes,
and it was
yes.
like €15. Now, my agency in Milan was one of the biggest agencies. There were hundreds of guys on the board, and in that magazine were probably 50 to 100 advertisements with models that they represented. When I looked at
Uh-huh.
my payslip, they said 4 copies of Uomo Vogue are billed to your account. So that's, I don't know, 50 euros. I mean, it seems like nothing, right? 50 euros or whatever it was around there. But then you start to realize that every single guy in the agency was paying for a
Mm-hmm.
full copy of the magazine, even though they were pulling 50 sheets out of each magazine. So they would buy 4
Yes.
copies and they would make, I don't know, 1,000 euros per magazine, depending on how many
Mm-hmm.
guys were in that copy. So this kind of stuff started. I was like, this is very strange. Your composite cards, your prints, which photographer you shoot with, they set it up, they take a cut. If you do it yourself, it costs half of what it would cost for the agency to do it for you. So
Mm-hmm.
you start to see that this is there's a system to this, and it's pretty much, you're like, okay, I get the business part of it. But then this sort of seedier part of it, um, it it I started to see that not in Paris, but when I got to Milan, and you're living in the model house, and you don't see it with the guys so much, but you see how the girls get treated. And it basically in Milan, it was, I'm not going to name anything because we'll get there, but the nightclubs in the 90s used to send what
Mm-hmm.
they called public relations people, PR people, to the airports
Yes, yes.
to meet the girls landing. They phone the agencies, find out which girls are landing at the airports. They go meet them in the airports and they take them to their hotels or their apartments. And they say, we're going to pick you up at 8 o'clock. We're going to take you out to a dinner. And then we're going to take you to a nightclub. And the nightclub is, of course, VIP sectioned. Now, the VIP section at a
Mm-hmm.
nightclub in a fashion city like that is basically prostitution without the girls understanding that they're being sold,
Mm-hmm.
because it is
Mm-hmm.
blocked off and the access is paid for. So you would pay for whatever it is, bottle service, or you pay to basically sit and have access to those people. My girlfriend at the time was quite a big model who, um, when we get into this story a bit, was she was a sort of a favorite of Giorgio Armani. She had done an Armani campaign, and
Mm-hmm.
her agency wanted her to be sort of the supermodel, and she also had been raped at a very young age and just never had the sort of confidence to want to go off. And she felt very safe with me, so we sort of traveled together, and spent time together. And she worked. So she said, I don't want to be a multimillionaire. I'm working. I make really good money, and I feel safe, and I don't have to spend every day on an airplane. And that was a conscious decision. But if we went to the club, she would be allowed into the VIP section, and they would say, "You're not allowed." And I'm like, "But
Mm-hmm.
that's my girlfriend, but you're not allowed." And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
"This is okay. I see where it starts to become obvious where this has gone." Um, and that system between the agencies, between the agencies, between the nightclubs, between the way the dinners are structured and how that whole thing worked, it's pretty obvious. And then what when you start to understand that it was how bad it was every time, not every time, but a lot of times when you go to the nightclubs from the model apartments and you're as a group, right? Because we were all friends. There's like 12 people
Mm-hmm.
staying in an apartment, um, guys and girls mixed. And then uh, so many times we'd be walking into the nightclub and one of the girls would break down crying, and I say, what's wrong? And she said, I can't go in. I can't go in. He's here. He's here. He's here. Or that PR is here, or that guy is here. And we're always, he cornered me. He raped me. He drugged me, whatever it was. And this was so common. It really, I mean, I knew one girl who was telling me, um, she was in Japan. She had been kidnapped for 4 days and raped repeatedly over a period of 4 days till she escaped. And this was not uncommon to hear stories like this. Um, and I, I never, so part of me was like, um, when it happened to me was I have been preparing for this moment, um, for a long time. I've sort of like, I've understood and I started to understand how people dealt with trauma, repressed trauma, um, and it started to become very aware to me how what was good, what was bad, what wasn't, and it honestly felt like I had been prepared for this moment that it had happened to me, but nothing actually
Yes.
prepares you for it, even though it felt that way at the time. And no,
So, can you take us back to Paris in 2002?
yeah. So
And
I my story, like I said, the first night um, I met this person, um, and we actually became friends. Um, a group of us became friends. There were about five of us that became friends with him, and this friendship lasted from 1997 to 2000 and when or 2002, where
Mhm,
he was quite a famous um, person in the music business. He managed some very famous French groups and a very famous international pop star. Um,
mhm,
and we traveled to uh, Brussels to go to concerts. We went to Amsterdam to go out. He was very wealthy. Um, and we actually had a lot of fun. Um, and I knew he was gay. I had never been exposed, as where I grew up. You, it was no one was gay. It just no one was openly gay. You never heard of it.
mhm,
Toronto and Montreal exposed me to that world more. Um, but he never hit on
mhm,
me. It never made me feel uncomfortable, never made me feel any way, any insecure or not safe for years. Um, in 2002, my girlfriend who I mentioned and I had a very bad breakup. Um, and
mhm,
then I left. I was living in Barcelona. I left Barcelona. I went to South Africa. She went to Miami. Um, I came back. My agency called me from Paris and said, "Chris, we need you to come back to Paris to do a casting. You're up for." Um, they called it options. So they basically the client will put you on option for a campaign or something, and that you're booked off those
mhm,
days. So it's quite a when you're option, it means you're in the running of like 5 to 10 people. And they said I'd been shortlisted, so there were about 3 people on option for a Lacoste perfume campaign. So this is big money. This was a big
yes,
opportunity. So I flew to Paris to go and see the client. Um, I told my agency, I said, please do not. I was in my 30s at the time. I told my agency, please do not put me in a model apartment. It's show season in Paris. I don't want to be living with a bunch of 18-year-old kids. I want to
mhm,
go to sleep. I want to look good for my casting. And sure enough, I walked into to the worst model apartment I've probably ever been into. And then, and I was meeting my friend for dinner that night. And, um, I was just like, I can't be in this place. So we went to dinner and he said, Chris, I've got an apartment. He had a beautiful apartment, probably 4 or 5 bedroom apartment. Um, and he said, just stay in one of the bedrooms. Um, and I had slept at his apartment before in the past. So for me, I was like, yeah, perfect. I didn't know he was in town. He's in town. Let's go for dinner. We have a chat. Um, and he was telling me, he had had some problems in business stuff. He had been in Miami and he had it, he had stitches in his lip and he said he was bitten by a dog. And now
mm,
when I look back on it, I'm like, maybe not. Um, so anyway, we went to dinner, had a glass of wine. Um, I think we went for one drink somewhere, went home. He says, we get back. He says, "Do you want a cup of tea? Let's watch a movie." Um, cool. I sat on the floor. So in the bedroom, there was a big open bedroom that opened into the lounge. And I was sitting with my back against the bed on the floor. I checked my emails and then I sat down to watch the movie. I can still remember the movie. It was called Bully, about quite a depressing movie about kids in my growing up in Florida. And I can almost remember what was happening in the movie, and then I don't remember anything. I drank my tea, don't remember anything. And then the actual process of it was so bizarre. It was like a dream, but not. And I, and I was, can I be graphic?
Yes, yes,
I
yes.
can. So the dream was that someone was performing oral sex on me. And I could feel like a beard, and it wasn't real, but it was real. I was confused, and then I remember being turned over and pushed down, and then um and then someone was having sex with me, and but I don't. None of it felt real, and I was, and then I don't remember anything else. And then I woke up the next morning in the bed in my underwear, and I had been fully clothed on the floor, and I was completely confused. I had no idea what was going on. And I stood up and he wasn't in the room. And I remember standing up and I went out. He was in the lounge and I said, the first thing I said to him, I said, "Did you have sex with me last night?" And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "But why am I in my underwear?" And he said, "Oh, you fell asleep and I just put you in the bed." And I was like, okay. And then I started to feel very nauseous, and
Mm-hmm.
then and something didn't feel right, and I went to the end of the hall where the bedroom was that I was supposed to stay in, and I locked myself in the bedroom for the rest of the day. I went to the toilet and I had blood on my anus, um, and I said, this this isn't right. Something's not right. But you're so blanked from whatever I had been given that my
Mm-hmm.
memory couldn't make sense of what had happened. Whether you're also starting to sort of repress what happened. I don't want to believe what happened. Um, but it was a very bizarre, sort of very difficult trying to piece together what had happened. Um, that we had another mutual friend, and I phoned him and I said, "Hey, I think this happened last night." And he said, "Well, what?" He said, "Well, we're coming over." He came with his girlfriend, and we were in. I remember the other guy came, and he said he had some music producer with him that he had invited over for dinner that night. I had basically hidden the whole day in until my friend came over, and then
Mm-hmm.
we actually confronted him in the kitchen, and we both said to him, Did you do this?" And he got very angry, very defensive. He denied it, and then he made a phone call. He said, "I'm going to call my doctor friend," and he put me on the phone with him. And I didn't know what to say. I'm like, and I don't know to this day, I don't know who I was on the phone with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then uh, he just kept denying it. He kept denying it, and we ended up going out for dinner. And then I was so confused. And then I remember the next day, I just said, "I'm out of here." I got on a plane. I flew back to um, to Barcelona, um, and then and then the hard part really started. Um, because that's when I got back to Barcelona, I realized that something had happened, um, and I was starting to put it together. Um, Now, the the I didn't go to the police, which I should have. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the truth was that the drugs had made me feel very like unsure of what I was saying, and my horrible breakup was still just like a month or two prior. I was not
Mm-hmm.
in a place to have. I didn't have any strength left in me. Um, it was a really dark place for me. And then what I learned about trauma was what for me with this was that the act itself didn't cause me trauma. It was the response after the act that sort of led to my trauma. Um, my initial discussions were my first discussion was with a mutual gay friend of my girlfriend and mine, my ex-girlfriend at the time, and told him the story, and he said, "Are you sure? That's terrible." And he said, "Whatever you do, don't tell her." And I said, "Why? I was with her for years. Why wouldn't I tell her?" He says, "You're not going to get the response that you want." And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what response I wanted. Um, and I remember the phone call I had with her. She was in Miami, and she I had to phone her about bills, and I broke down crying, and she said, what's wrong? And I said, I can't tell you, I can't talk to you about it. And then um she said, "No, I know everything's been so horrible, but please, we're still friends, I still love you," and da 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 da. And then I told her, and this is not a it sounds very harsh, and it's going to sound very harsh, but I don't hold this against her, but
Mm-hmm.
she hung up the phone. Um, because of her own trauma, she couldn't help me with mine, and that was very painful. To have
Yes.
someone hang up the phone, um, and then that that sort of difficult. This is where the trauma really starts to kick in, and what I understand about it is that, and I see it very clearly when I hear discussions about women going to the police, or women going and not being believed, or um, not, you're not sort of embraced straight away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that is very, very difficult. And that followed with my parents when I spoke to my parents. And I told my dad, and my dad never really liked me modeling. He thought he always said, "No, you need to do your masters, and you need to do this, and you need to be more." He had different aspirations for me. Um, and when I told him, and I don't blame him either, um, but we had a very challenging period of time. But when I told him, he just said to me, "Well, this is the business, this is kind of the business you're in." And I later learned that my parents were having a really hard time as well, and my sister. So everything happened in a week. My parents were having a hard time. My sister was having a hard time,
Yes.
and then and my dad. But my dad's response um, was definitely not the one I wanted or was helpful. Um, and and the truth is, I phoned a couple of people. Uh, this must have been a day or two after everything had happened, and I spoke to my ex-girlfriend from university. Sorry, getting a bit choked up here, but when I told her, um, she just said, "I'll be on a plane tomorrow."
Mm.
And that meant, meant a lot to hear that from someone. It
Yes.
really, that was sort of the moment that I was looking for. Um, and that still gets to me when I tell that version of this story about how the fact that she just said, "I'll be there for you." And I hadn't seen her for years. Um,
Mm.
so that was that initial period of time. And that is where the sort of trauma came from. When I um it manifested differently for me than so when people who haven't been through it m- m- may think that it's the act itself that re-traumatizes you. It's never the act for me. It's never the actual rape itself that traumatizes me. It was everything that followed. um I can talk about the rape without a problem. It's these discussions that sort of really dig deep.
Mm.
um
Mhm.
and then the manifestation of my sort of whatever you want to call it, PTSD, was very different. So I started to get panic attacks. Never had a panic
Mhm.
attack in my life, but it started, and it was not what you would think. It was on a plane. So I remember getting on a plane, first time not the first time after, but a couple of months, maybe a month later, and the doors to the plane closed. And I remember just thinking, I can't be on this plane. I need you. And I told the stewardess, I said, you need to get me off this plane. And
Mm.
she sat down. She actually sat down and held my hand and talked me through it. But I didn't know what was going on, and couldn't breathe. I was panicking. I was um, feeling like, and that sort of oddly became a thing for me. Then suddenly that trigger was a plane. It wasn't about being afraid of flying. It was just about being locked into that space and not having, I guess, the control out of it. Um, so that that trauma, that anger, and that with my breakup, with that happening, I felt very, very alone. And that kept me, the combination of the two kept me from having relationships for many, serious relationships for many years. I started to push
Mm.
people away. Um, I started to, um, I wanted people close to me, but I didn't want them close to me. So I would substitute sort of sex for relationships. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
so I could be close, but not close enough to
Not
ever
too
open
close.
up.
Yes.
Yeah. And that lasted a long, quite a long time, where I would date for a few weeks, but I would never. I was very, very protective. But oddly enough, I was still seeking attention in ways. Like I still
Mm.
wanted to be loved. I still wanted to be um, sort of treated like people cared. But at the same time, I was facing it alone because through my breakup, I lost a lot of friends, and then through the rape, because it happened at a time when this never happened to men openly.
Mm.
Like I remember looking for a therapist. It didn't exist. You couldn't find a therapist who had ever dealt with men who had
Yes.
been raped. It in the early 2000s, this wasn't spoken of. The only thing it was ever spoken of was with young boys and the priesthood. And I read about it, to try to understand my trauma, whether it was the same or whether it was different. Um, and then I started to, have to put my context, because it was so common for women to go through in in a in a context that wasn't mine.
Mm.
Um, and that, I guess,
Still to
in
this
a way,
day,
created an
right?
empathy. Hmm?
But still, to this day, it's very difficult for men to come forward.
2009, I think I wrote a letter to Interpol. I filed the charges when I heard that someone else had filed charges, and I ended up being in contact with the French police and Interpol, lodged a formal complaint. I got a letter back maybe 8 months later saying the statute of limitations for sexual abuse are 3 years in France. And I said, but I was raped. I wasn't, and that's 10 years. I wasn't sexually abused. And they said, well, this was the judgment. So they said, but you can testify in his trial as a witness. And I found this out 3 days ago, that he had been let out of jail 30 days after he had been convicted. But then I found some information linking him to a guy named Jean-Luc Brunel, who was the modeling scout for Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes,
so
yes.
the two of them were notorious in the Paris scene for a pipeline of young models.